She went into labor alone, and when the doctor walked in, her world shattered. It was her billionaire ex-husband. Emma Carter had never felt more alone than she did that night. The sterile white of the hospital delivery room seemed too bright, too cold, and far too silent without the comforting presence of anyone she could call family. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above her as she lay on the bed, one hand clutching the thin sheet so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale. Sweat trickled down her temple, her chest rising and falling in quick, uneven breaths as another contraction surged through her body. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, determined not to show weakness to the nurses who passed briskly in and out of the room. For months she had prepared herself for this moment, telling herself over and over that she could do it, that she would be strong for the child who was about to arrive. The father of the baby had left long ago, vanishing the moment responsibility became real, and her own parents had distanced themselves the day she decided to carry the pregnancy alone. She had told herself she was ready to face this battle alone, but as the pain tightened its grip on her, a tremor of fear worked its way into her chest. "I can do this," she whispered under her breath, her voice trembling but firm. "I have to." The sound of the door opening made her look up, expecting another nurse. Instead, a man stepped into the room, tall and composed, his white coat falling neatly over his shoulders. His presence carried an authority that immediately silenced the room, as though the air itself recognized his power. Emma froze, her eyes locking on his face, her heart plummeting into her stomach. The strong jawline, the deep brown eyes, the dark hair swept back with careful precision. She knew them all. She had memorized every line of that face once, kissed every curve of it, dreamed of it in moments of happiness and in years of loneliness. Michael Harrison. The world seemed to tilt beneath her. She hadn't spoken his name aloud in years, hadn't dared to imagine that their paths would ever cross again. And yet here he was, not just in the same city, not just in the same building, but in her delivery room. Her ex-husband, the man she had once promised forever to. The man who had walked away with her heart shattered in pieces. The man who had since become a legend. The billionaire CEO, the face on magazine covers, the one whispered about in financial circles as untouchable, unstoppable. For a second, Emma forgot to breathe. Her chest tightened, not from the contraction, but from the tidal wave of emotions that surged through her. Shock, fury, heartbreak, and something else she refused to name. She wanted to scream, to demand why fate had played such a cruel joke on her. But another contraction ripped through her body and stole her words. Michael's gaze met hers, and for the first time in years, she saw something break in his perfectly composed expression. His brown eyes widened with recognition, then darkened with something heavier. Regret, disbelief, pain. He stopped mid-step as if struck by lightning, his entire frame stiffening. For a moment, the commanding doctor and powerful executive vanished, and he was simply a man seeing the woman he had once loved in her most vulnerable moment. "Emma," he said, his voice low, unsteady. Just her name, but it held the weight of their entire history. She turned her face away, biting down hard on her lip until she tasted blood. "Don't," she whispered hoarsely. "Don't you dare." Her pulse hammered in her ears. Of all the doctors in the world, of all the nights in all the hospitals, it had to be him. She had prepared herself for pain, for loneliness, for the grueling hours of labor. But she hadn't prepared for this. The ghosts she had spent years bearing were suddenly standing at her bedside, wearing a white coat and holding her fate in his hands. The room suddenly felt too small, too suffocating. She wanted him gone, wanted to erase the look in his eyes, the memories threatening to pull her under. But she knew the truth, as bitter as it was undeniable. Tonight she had no choice. He was her doctor, and he was the only one who could bring her child safely into the world. And that terrifying, unbearable truth was the last thing she wanted to face. Emma's pulse raced, her breath uneven as another contraction gripped her body, forcing her to clutch the edge of the bed with both hands. Sweat dampened her hairline, but the heat that burned through her veins wasn't just from labor. It was from the man standing in front of her. Michael's presence filled the room, and no matter how hard she tried to shut him out, every sound, every movement he made pulled her back into a past she had worked so hard to bury. "Emma," he said again, softer this time, as if afraid she might shatter if he spoke too loudly. His voice carried the weight of years unsaid. Apologies never made, confessions never spoken. He stepped closer, the clipboard in his hand trembling slightly though he tried to steady it. To anyone else, he looked like the perfect professional, calm, commanding, in control. But Emma knew him too well. She saw the hesitation in his eyes, the flicker of vulnerability behind the carefully built wall of authority. "Stop!" she rasped through clenched teeth, her body arching as pain shot through her. She turned her face away, blinking against the tears that threatened. "Just do your job. Don't talk to me. Not now." "Not ever," Michael hesitated, his chest rising sharply. He wanted to argue, to tell her that the years hadn't erased what they had shared. But the steady beeping of the monitor beside her reminded him that this wasn't the time for words. He swallowed hard and forced his voice into a clinical tone. "Your contractions are coming quickly. I need to check dilation." Emma shut her eyes as he moved to the foot of the bed, his touch professional, careful, almost mechanical. But she couldn't separate his hands now from the memory of those same hands once holding her waist in the dark, brushing against her skin with tenderness, tracing promises into her life that he had ultimately broken. She bit back a sob, the emotional pain twisting almost as fiercely as the physical. "Everything looks stable for now," he said after a moment, his voice clipped, businesslike. Yet even in that practiced detachment, Emma heard it, the faint tremor of something human, something personal. He was fighting himself, and she hated that she could still tell. She forced her eyes open, glaring at him through the haze of pain. "Why are you here, Michael? Don't you have 100 other doctors working under you? Why did it have to be you in this room?" He looked at her then, really looked, and the mask slipped. His expression was raw, unguarded, almost pained. "I didn't know. I came on call tonight because one of the residents had an emergency. I didn't know it would be you." The contraction eased, leaving Emma drained, trembling against the pillow. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him he was lying, that fate couldn't possibly be so cruel. But the way his voice cracked, the way his eyes softened, no, he wasn't lying. "And if you had known," she asked bitterly, her throat tight, "would you have run the other way? Like before?" Her words hit him harder than he expected. He inhaled sharply, his hand tightening around the clipboard. For a moment he didn't answer. Then quietly he said, "No, I wouldn't have run." Not this time. Emma turned her face toward the wall, tears finally slipping down her cheek. She didn't want his answers. She didn't want his regrets. All she wanted was to survive this night, to bring her baby safely into the world. But deep down, under the layers of hurt and resentment, her heart ached at the sincerity in his tone. The nurse entered then, breaking the heavy silence. She checked the monitors quickly and looked at Michael. "Contractions are intensifying. We should prepare in case things progress faster than expected." Michael nodded, his professional mask snapping back into place. "We'll keep monitoring closely. If the baby shows any signs of distress, we act immediately." Emma squeezed her eyes shut as the nurse left, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. She hated that her life, her child's life, was in his hands. She hated that part of her, no matter how much she resisted, still trusted him when everything else inside her screamed not to. And Michael, standing at her bedside, hated that he could see every ounce of her pain and know that he had been part of causing it long before tonight. For the first time in years, both of them were trapped in the same space, bound not by marriage vows or love, but by necessity and by the fragile, terrifying life waiting to be born. The hours crawled by, and the delivery room became a battlefield of pain and silence. Emma's breaths grew harsher, her hair damp with sweat, the hospital gown clinging to her trembling frame. Each contraction gripped her body like a vice, pulling cries from her throat that she tried to muffle, unwilling to give Michael the satisfaction of hearing her vulnerability. She had survived too much in her life to let him see her broken. But the truth was, she had never felt so fragile. Michael stood nearby, monitoring the machines, giving the occasional quiet instruction to the nurses. He moved with precision, his hands steady, his voice clipped and professional. But every time Emma's face contorted with pain, his own chest tightened. He forced himself to keep his expression neutral, yet inside he was unraveling. The woman he once swore to protect, the woman he had loved more than his own future, was fighting through this storm without anyone by her side. And it was his fault she had been left so alone. Her heart rate's climbing, a nurse murmured, glancing at the monitor. Michael immediately stepped closer, his gaze shifting from the screen to Emma. She was gripping the side of the bed, her knuckles white, her breath shallow. He crouched beside her, lowering his voice so only she could hear. Emma, you need to slow your breathing. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Steady. Like we used to practice. Her eyes snapped open, fiery with anger even through the haze of pain. Don't you dare, she hissed. Don't talk to me like you know me anymore. The words hit like a slap, but Michael didn't flinch. He kept his tone calm, his hand hovering near hers without touching. I know you don't want me here, but right now it's not about you and me. It's about the baby. Focus on her. Breathe for her. Emma's chest heaved, her eyes filling with tears. She wanted to scream at him, to curse him out of the room, but the truth cut deeper. She did need him, not as her ex-husband, not as the billionaire CEO, but as the doctor who stood between her child and danger. Trembling, she let his voice guide her, dragging air in ragged breaths until the sharpest edge of the contraction eased. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The monitors beeped steadily, but the tension in the room grew heavier with every tick of the clock. And then the sound changed, a quick, uneven rhythm from the fetal monitor. The baby's heartbeat faltered. Decelerations, the nurse whispered urgently, her eyes flicking to Michael. Emma heard it too, panic surging in her chest. What's happening? What's wrong? Michael's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm, steady. The baby's under stress. It could be the cord, it could be positioning. We're going to do everything to help her, but we need to act quickly. Emma's pulse thundered in her ears. Fear consumed her, hotter and sharper than any contraction. No, 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 you can't let anything happen to her, she cried, clutching her stomach. Her eyes locked onto his, wide and desperate. Michael, please, I save her. Please, something in the way she said his name. A plea, a command, a cry, all in one, pierced through the armor he had built around himself. In that moment, he wasn't the CEO, wasn't the surgeon, wasn't the man she hated. He was the man who once swore he would give her the world. And here she was, asking him to give her just one thing, their child's life. He leaned closer, his gaze fierce, his voice like steel. I swear to you, Emma, I will do everything. I won't let her go. Not while I'm here. The nurses moved quickly around them, preparing the equipment, murmuring medical terms under their breath. Emma clung to his words, to the intensity in his eyes. For the first time since he had walked into the room, she felt the faintest flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself in years. Trust. Fragile, painful, terrifying trust. Another contraction racked her body, but she barely noticed the pain this time. All she could think of was the tiny life inside her, the uneven beeping on the monitor, and the man she once loved standing over her like a shield against the storm. As Michael gave sharp orders to the team, his voice echoing with authority, Emma realized something that made her chest ache. For all the years she had hated him, for all the bitterness she had carried, at this moment, she had never needed him more. And that truth was almost harder to bear than the pain tearing through her body. The room erupted into a flurry of movement, but Emma could only hear the pounding of her own heart, a deafening drum that drowned out the voices around her. The monitor's beeping grew erratic, shrill, screaming a warning that made her blood run cold. She clutched her stomach as if her hands alone could shield the tiny life inside, tears streaming unchecked down her face. Her breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. Michael's voice cut through the chaos, steady and commanding. Prep the OR. We're moving her for an emergency C-section. The nurses snapped into action, wheeling trays, unhooking cords, preparing medications. Emma's eyes flew wide, panic exploding in her chest. No, wait! Surgery, what does that mean? What's happening to her? Her voice cracked, the desperation in it raw and unfiltered. Michael moved to her side, crouching low enough so she could see his face clearly through the haze of fear and pain. His brown eyes, once so familiar, held a fierce determination that rooted her in place. Emma, listen to me. The baby is in distress. Her heartbeat is dropping. If we wait, we risk losing her. Surgery is the safest way to bring her out now. Her head shook violently, denial clashing with terror. No, no, I can't. I can't go through that. Another contraction tore through her, silencing her protests, and she cried out, gripping the rails of the bed so tightly her fingers ached. Michael reached for her hand without thinking, and for a moment she didn't pull away. His hand enveloped hers, strong, grounding, anchoring her to reality when she felt like she was drowning. Emma, he said firmly, his voice lower, gentler, almost pleading beneath the authority. I know you don't want to trust me. I know I'm the last person you ever wanted to see in this room, but right now you need to. For her, for your daughter. I won't let anything happen to her. Or to you. Her tear-streaked face turned toward him, her eyes wide with fear, but also with the ghost of something else. A memory of the man who once held her and promised forever. She wanted to tell him she hated him, that she couldn't believe a word he said. But the truth was, at this moment, she had no one else. And the life of the tiny being she had carried for 9 months depended on her letting go of her pride, her anger, her fear, and giving him her trust, no matter how broken it was. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Please, just save her." Something unspoken passed between them in that instant, a flicker of the bond they once shared, and Michael squeezed her hand gently before rising to his full height. "We're taking her now," he ordered, his voice snapping the room back into motion. The nurses rushed to unhook wires and roll the bed, and Emma felt herself moving, the ceiling lights flashing above her in rapid succession as they wheeled her toward the operating room. Her heart raced, her body trembling uncontrollably. She wanted to scream, to claw her way off the bed, but she forced herself to hold on to his words, clinging to them like a lifeline. In the OR, the sterile brightness was blinding. The team swarmed around her, masks pulled tight, hands moving with precision. Michael scrubbed in quickly, trading his white coat for surgical gear. For a moment, Emma's mind spun as she realized just how surreal this was. The man who once kissed her with such tenderness was now about to cut into her body to save her child. The anesthesiologist worked swiftly, and Emma felt the numbness spread, her body surrendering to the inevitability of the procedure. Fear clawed at her chest, but then Michael appeared above her, eyes meeting hers over the surgical mask. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, a simple gesture, but one that steadied her. "You're going to hear a lot of noise," he murmured, his voice meant only for her. "Don't focus on that. Focus on the outcome. In just a few minutes, you'll meet your daughter." Her throat tightened, her vision blurring with tears. She wanted to believe him, wanted to let his calmness seep into her bones. The beeping of the monitor seemed to quicken, her baby still fighting, still struggling. Emma whispered through trembling lips, "Don't let her go, Michael. Please." His hand squeezed her shoulder again, firmer this time. "I won't. I promise." And with that, he turned his attention to the table, to the precise, dangerous work ahead. Every movement of his hands was careful, deliberate, honed from years of training. But this was different from every other operation he had ever performed. This wasn't just a patient. This wasn't just another statistic. This was Emma. And this was a child who might have been his. As the scalpel touched her skin, the room filled with the rhythm of commands, the hum of machines, and the thrum of anticipation. Emma closed her eyes, clinging to the sound of his voice as he guided the team. For the first time in years, she let herself surrender. Not to him, not to the man who broke her heart, but to the doctor who might be the only person who could give her back the one thing she could not live without. And in that surrender, something shifted inside her, a fragile, reluctant hope. The bright white of the operating room blurred in Emma's vision, her lashes heavy with tears as the numbness spread through her body. She lay flat, her arms trembling slightly where they rested at her sides, the sterile drape dividing her from what was happening below. Every sound seemed amplified. The clang of instruments, the murmur of voices, the sharp, steady commands coming from Michael as he directed the team. She couldn't see him now, but she could hear him, and his voice was the only thing tethering her to reality. "Scalpel," he said firmly. "Steady. Suction." Here Emma tried to focus on breathing, just breathing, but fear clawed at her chest. Her child's heartbeat had been faltering only minutes ago. What if they were too late? What if she never heard that first cry? Her fingers twitched, aching to grip something, and then she felt it. The light, grounding pressure of Michael's hand against her arm above the drape. He wasn't supposed to be there. The surgeon wasn't supposed to split himself between the table and the patient's comfort, but he did it anyway. And somehow that touch steadied her, even though her heart warred against it. Minutes stretched like hours. Sweat beaded along Michael's brow beneath his surgical cap, his dark eyes laser-focused on the task before him. Every incision, every movement carried not just the weight of his training, but the unbearable pressure of personal stakes. This wasn't just another patient. This was Emma, and the child he was fighting to deliver might very well be the last link between them. His chest tightened with the thought, but he forced it down, pushing himself into the mechanical rhythm of the surgery. The air grew heavier when the baby's heart monitor beeped faintly, irregularly. Emma gasped, her panic rising again. "What's happening? Why is it? Why is it slowing?" Her voice cracked, trembling with terror. Michael leaned closer to the drape, his voice calm but urgent. "Emma, look at me. Don't focus on the sound. Focus on me. She's fighting. I've got her. Do you hear me? I've got her." Her vision blurred with tears, but she nodded, clinging to his words like a lifeline. And then it happened. After what felt like an eternity, the sharp cry of a newborn split the sterile air of the operating room. High, raw, alive. The sound punched the breath from Emma's chest. Her entire body shook as sobs tore through her, the flood of relief too powerful to contain. "She's here," she whispered through her tears. "Oh God, she's here." Michael closed his eyes briefly, his own chest rising with a tremor he couldn't suppress. He handed the baby off to the nurse, his hands lingering just a second longer on the tiny, fragile body before pulling back. The nurse moved quickly, checking vitals, suctioning, wrapping the infant in a warm blanket. But Michael's attention was locked on Emma, who was craning her neck desperately, her eyes wild with need. "Is she okay?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "Tell me she's okay." The nurse smiled faintly beneath her mask, lifting the swaddled newborn. "She's strong. A little fighter." And then the baby was placed gently into Emma's waiting arms. Emma cradled her daughter to her chest, her tears falling freely onto the tiny pink cheeks. The baby stirred, letting out another cry before settling against her mother's heartbeat. Emma kissed her forehead again and again, whispering broken words of love and promises she had rehearsed for months. Michael stood frozen for a moment, the sight piercing him deeper than any scalpel ever could. Emma, radiant even in exhaustion, holding the child with a look of raw devotion. For a flicker of a second, he allowed himself the forbidden thought. This could have been us. This could have been our family. Emma looked up at him then, her eyes red and swollen but filled with something he hadn't seen in years. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the undeniable acknowledgement that he had saved them both. She held his gaze as if silently telling him that for this moment, she trusted him. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to step back, to let the nurses finish their work. His hands, still steady from surgery, shook slightly as he pulled off his gloves. The room was buzzing with routine procedures now, but for him, the world had narrowed to the image of Emma and the baby, an image that he knew would haunt him long after this night ended. Emma bent her head over the tiny girl, her voice hoarse and trembling as she whispered, "You're safe now, sweetheart. Mama's here." Then, almost as if the words slipped out against her will, she added softly, "And so is he." Michael heard it. His chest ached with the weight of it, with the knowledge that despite everything, despite the wreckage of their past, fate had put him back in her life in the most profound, irreversible way. And for the first time in years, he felt something he had thought he'd lost forever. Hope. The recovery room was dimmer, quieter, a stark contrast to the sterile chaos of the operating theater. Emma lay propped against a thin stack of pillows, her gown loose around her shoulders, her body aching and weak but her arms full. Her daughter, small, perfect, swaddled in a hospital blanket, slept against her chest, her tiny breaths rising and falling in rhythm with Emma's. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, but all Emma could hear was the soft, steady hum of her baby's breathing. For the first time in months, she felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. But then she heard the door click open, and that peace fractured. Michael stepped inside quietly. No surgical mask, no gloves, no sterile armor. Just him, tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair slightly mussed, his brown eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He had changed into simple scrubs, but he still carried himself with the air of someone who was never fully able to shed his power. Emma's heart twisted as she looked at him. He seemed both achingly familiar and impossibly distant, like a ghost from another life. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Michael's gaze dropped to the bundle in her arms, and his chest rose with a tremor he couldn't disguise. "She's beautiful," he said softly, his voice raw. "Just like her mother." Emma tightened her hold on the baby, her jaw clenching. She wanted to reject the compliment, to push back with the bitterness that had been her shield for years, but the words hit her harder than she expected. She swallowed, her throat tight, and forced her voice into a whisper. Don't, don't say things like that." "Not now." He moved closer, cautiously, as if afraid that one wrong step would send her retreating further into herself. He stopped at the foot of the bed, keeping a respectful distance. "You were incredible in there," he murmured. "I don't think I've ever seen anyone fight so hard." "You saved her, Emma. You carried her through everything." Her eyes flicked up sharply. "No, you saved her. If it wasn't for you, she—" Her voice broke, and she pressed her lips together, burying her face briefly against the baby's head. "I don't even want to think about it." Michael's hands curled into fists at his sides, the memory of the faltering heartbeat still fresh in his mind. "I didn't save her alone. You trusted me, even when you had every reason not to. That trust, it mattered." Emma gave a short, bitter laugh, though it cracked with exhaustion. "Trust? You think I trust you?" "Michael, I didn't have a choice. My baby's life was on the line. You could have been a stranger, and I still would have begged you." She glanced up at him, her eyes hard despite the tears pooling there. "But you weren't a stranger. You were the man who left me, who chose everything else over me, and that's what makes this unbearable." The words hit him like blows, but he didn't flinch. He deserved them. Every accusation, every ounce of her pain. His voice dropped lower, softer. "I know. And I would give anything to undo the choices I made. I was so blinded by ambition, by the need to prove myself, that I didn't see what I was destroying. You, U.S. I thought I had time to fix it later. But later never came." Emma's eyes filled, but she blinked fiercely, refusing to let the tears fall. "You don't get to say that now. You don't get to show up after years and pretend you regret it. My life didn't pause when you walked away. I had to keep going. I had to learn how to survive without you." She lowered her gaze to the tiny baby in her arms, brushing her thumb gently over her daughter's cheek. "And now, I have someone who depends on me completely. I can't afford to let the past rip me apart again." Michael stepped closer, his voice steady but threaded with emotion. "Emma, I'm not asking you to forget. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But when I saw you on that table, when I held her in my hands—" His voice cracked, and he had to pause, pressing a hand against his chest as if to steady himself. "Everything I thought mattered. The boardrooms, the money, the empire I built. It all felt meaningless compared to this. Compared to her, compared to you." Silence filled the room, heavy and fragile. Emma looked at him, her heart twisting painfully at the raw honesty in his eyes. For a moment, she saw not the CEO, not the billionaire, not the man who had broken her. She saw the boy who once held her hand under the stars and promised her a future. She hated that part of her, still longed for him, still ached for what they had lost. Finally, she whispered, her voice barely audible, "Why now? Why are you saying this now when it's too late?" Michael's gaze dropped to the baby, his expression softening. "Because maybe it isn't too late. Maybe life just gave us another chance." Emma's throat tightened, and she shook her head quickly, clutching her daughter closer. Don't talk about chances. I don't have the strength to believe in them anymore." He wanted to argue, to tell her that she was wrong, that he would fight to prove it wasn't too late, but he stopped himself. Instead, he simply nodded, backing away slowly, giving her the space she needed. Before leaving the room, he looked back one last time, his voice quiet but certain. "I'll be here, whether you want me to or not. I'm not running again." The door closed softly behind him, and Emma was left in the dim room, holding her sleeping daughter. She stared at the tiny face nestled against her chest, her tears finally slipping free. For the first time in years, she didn't know what terrified her more. the pain of the past or the possibility of a future that fate seemed determined to place back in her hands. The days after the delivery blurred into a haze of exhaustion, hushed cries in the fragile rhythm of new life. Emma barely left the hospital bed, her body still sore and heavy with weakness, while her daughter, still unnamed because Emma could not yet bring herself to choose alone, curled in her arms, demanding every ounce of her strength. She thought she would be alone in this, as she always had been, but each time she opened her eyes, there was Michael. At first, she thought it was some trick of her mind, the lingering echo of their past making her imagine him still there. But no, he was real. She saw him sitting in the corner chair with his tie discarded and sleeves rolled up, his posture relaxed but his eyes always sharp, watching over her like a sentinel. She saw him when nurses came in, answering questions before she could, making sure instructions were followed precisely. She saw him when her body trembled with fatigue, and without asking, he lifted the baby gently into his arms, rocking her with a tenderness Emma had never expected from him again. It was disorienting, infuriating, and terrifying. This wasn't the man who had left her behind. This wasn't the cold CEO whose life revolved around boardrooms and headlines. This was someone else, or perhaps someone she had once known, buried beneath the years of distance and ambition. One night, when the corridors were quiet and the world outside the hospital windows seemed impossibly far away, Emma woke to the sound of soft humming. She turned her head and saw Michael standing by the window with the baby cradled against his chest. His large hands supported her tiny head, his voice a low, unfamiliar melody, as he hummed a lullaby she hadn't heard in years. Her throat tightened. "You remember that?" she whispered hoarsely. He turned, surprised to find her awake. His eyes softened. "Of course I do. You used to sing it when you were nervous. The night before our wedding, you sang it in the dark because you couldn't sleep." The memory cut through her like a blade. The way she had felt then, so young, so certain that love would carry them through anything. That certainty had shattered long ago, but hearing him recall it now made her chest ache with something dangerously close to longing. "Don't," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Don't bring that back. I can't." Michael crossed the room slowly, careful not to startle her, and placed the sleeping baby into her arms. "I'm not trying to hurt you, Emma. I want you to know that I didn't forget. Not you. Not us. I buried it, but I never forgot." Emma held the baby close, her tears blurring her vision. She wanted to push him away, to build the walls higher, but his presence was relentless, breaking through cracks she hadn't realized were still open. "Why are you doing this?" she asked suddenly, her voice raw. "Why stay here? You don't owe me anything. You don't owe her anything. You could walk away again, and it wouldn't be your burden." Michael crouched beside the bed, his eyes locking onto hers with a steadiness that made it hard to breathe. "Because walking away was the biggest mistake of my life, and I refuse to make it twice. You're right. I don't deserve forgiveness. I don't deserve a place here, but I want to earn one. For her. For you. Even if you never let me back in, I'll still be here, making sure you're not alone this time." Emma stared at him, her chest heaving, her heart torn between fury and the flickering spark of something she had sworn she would never feel again. The sincerity in his eyes was almost unbearable. She wanted to hate him, to throw every word of anger she'd held inside at him. But instead, she whispered the truth that frightened her most. "I don't know if I can believe you." Michael nodded, his expression steady. "Then don't believe me. Watch me, let me prove it," and he did. Over the next few days, he was there in the smallest, quietest ways, holding the baby while Emma showered, adjusting her pillows without asking, making late-night calls to ensure her discharge papers would go smoothly. He never demanded her attention, never pressed her with more words. He simply stayed, a constant presence, letting his actions speak where promises no longer carried weight. And slowly, against her will, Emma began to feel something shift inside her. Not trust, not yet, but the faint, fragile possibility of it. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, the man she had once loved had finally found his way back. But that possibility terrified her even more than the idea of facing this life alone. Emma's discharge day came sooner than she expected. The hospital felt almost safe after everything that had happened. Its sterile walls, the steady hum of machines, the watchful nurses who appeared at the press of a button. But as she sat on the edge of the bed, her daughter nestled in her arms, reality loomed large outside those doors. The moment she stepped out, it would be her against the world again. Or at least, that was what she kept telling herself. Michael was there, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, watching her with an intensity that both steadied and unsettled her. He had been there every day since the delivery, quiet but constant, like the shadow she couldn't escape. And yet, for all her resistance, a small, traitorous part of her had begun to find comfort in it. The nurse entered with paperwork, smiling at the baby before setting the forms on the tray. "Everything looks good, Emma. You and your little girl are ready to go home." The word stung. Home wasn't the tiny apartment where the landlord barely fixed the leaks, where loneliness pressed on her chest in the silence of the night. Home had once been something else entirely, filled with laughter and warmth, with Michael's voice drifting down the hall. She shoved the memory away and focused on the baby instead, brushing her thumb over her daughter's soft cheek. "What's her name?" the nurse asked gently. Emma hesitated. She had avoided the question for days, unable to decide. Naming her daughter alone felt unbearable, a reminder of everything she had lost. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She lowered her gaze, shame heating her cheeks. "She doesn't have one yet," Michael said softly, breaking the silence. Emma shot him a sharp look, but he didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his voice steady but gentle. "Emma, may I?" She stiffened. "That's not your place." "No," he agreed, "but maybe it could be ours." Together, the nurse, sensing the tension, excused herself quietly, leaving them alone. The room grew heavy, the air thick with everything unspoken. Emma clutched the baby tighter, her heart racing. "Don't do this. Don't act like we can just go back. Too much has happened. You left me when I needed you most." I can't forget that Michael knelt in front of her, his gaze unwavering, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the bed. "I don't want to erase the past, Emma. I couldn't, even if I tried. But I can choose what I do now. I can choose to stay. I can choose to be here, for both of you. Let me prove that I'm not the man who walked away." "Not anymore." Her throat tightened, tears stinging her eyes. She wanted to scream at him, to push him away, to shield herself from the hope clawing its way into her chest. But then the baby stirred, letting out a small cry, and Michael reached out instinctively. Without thinking, Emma let him take her. He cradled the baby in his arms with a tenderness that made Emma's heart ache. "She deserves more than fear," he said quietly, rocking the tiny girl. "She deserves parents who will fight for her, no matter what." "You've already proven you'll fight for her." "Let me prove the same." Emma stared at him, her defenses crumbling with every word. She saw the exhaustion etched into his face, the vulnerability he no longer tried to hide, the way he looked at their daughter as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. And for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder. Maybe he truly had changed. Maybe the man she had once loved was still there, waiting for her to see him again. "Her name," Emma whispered, her voice breaking. "I was going to call her Grace." Michael's eyes softened, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Grace," he repeated, as if testing it on his tongue. "It's perfect." He looked back at Emma, and in his gaze she saw something that terrified and comforted her all at once. Hope, fragile but fierce. She swallowed hard, her chest tightening. "I don't know if I can trust you again, Michael. I don't know if I can let myself believe." He leaned closer, his voice low but certain. "Then don't trust me yet. Just trust what you see. Trust what I do. Let grace be the reason we try again." Silence stretched between them, thick with years of pain and the fragile spark of something new. Emma felt the weight of her fear pressing down on her, but beneath it, something else stirred. A longing she had buried deep, a yearning for family, for love, for the life she thought was lost forever. She wiped at her tears with her free hand, her voice trembling but steady. "One chance, Michael. That's all you get. For her, not for me." Michael's throat tightened, his eyes glistening. "One chance is all I need." And in that moment, as the baby shifted softly in his arms, and Emma watched them both with wary hope, the walls around her heart cracked just enough to let in the possibility of a future she thought she'd never have again. They walked out of the hospital hours later, Not as strangers bound only by the past, but as something fragile, unfinished, and new. A man, a woman, and a tiny girl named Grace. And though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was undeniable. Life had given them another beginning, and this time, neither of them intended to waste it. What makes it powerful is not just that Emma and Michael find their way back to each other, but how it happens. It's not through easy forgiveness or sweeping away the past with a single grand gesture. It's through fear, pain, and the near loss of the one thing that mattered most, their child. The delivery room became both battlefield and redemption arc, forcing them to confront everything they had avoided for years. For Emma, the ending isn't about suddenly trusting again. It's about allowing herself to imagine that trust could be rebuilt. Her choice to give Michael one chance isn't weakness, it's courage, because after everything, hope is the hardest thing to carry. For Michael, the victory isn't that he saved Emma and the baby medically, or that he convinced her to let him stay. It's that he finally chose people over power, love over ambition. For once, he didn't run, didn't hide behind the armor of being a CEO or a billionaire. He stood present, raw, and willing to be judged by his actions instead of his status. The beauty of the ending lies in its imperfection. They don't ride off into a fairy tale. They walk out of the hospital as a fragile family with more questions than answers. And yet that fragility feels real. Life has handed them a second chance, not wrapped in certainty, but in possibility. And sometimes possibility is the bravest kind of happy ending we can ask for.